Hi, thank you for being here today. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the patterns that we find ourselves creating beyond childhood into adulthood, um, with an emphasis on adult relationships and then some other sort of associated emotional responses that we find ourselves having. Um, as with all these things, understanding the origins of these patterns can help us to create more grounded and authentic adult connections. But also, it's about understanding ourselves as having had intuitive, very natural responses to a very difficult early start in life in terms of the separation from our biological mother and how that has affected us and the patterns that we go on to create and the emotional responses that we go on to have as a result of that. Starting with adult intimate relationships, many people who've been adopted describe a kind of um, a tension around intimacy. And that tension can play out like we want closeness, but actually, when it becomes real, it can feel really uneasy. We might find ourselves trusting very easily at first and then sort of withdrawing, questioning the connection. Many of us find that we run to independence or to some other sort of safe space or something else that feels maybe slightly safer. Others hold on really tightly, often too tightly, because the idea of losing someone is so overwhelming. The point about this is that these are not random behaviors. They develop in response to that early uncertainty in life. So, intimacy can stir up mixed reactions because we can crave connection at the same time as feeling very exposed or afraid of what that deeper closeness might bring up. Feelings that are linked to that early loss or vulnerability are very, very real and live on even when we don't consciously remember them. Physical closeness can feel equally complex. Our bodies often respond with anxiety or shut down. And Bessel van der Kolk has written a very important, famous book called the Body Keeps the Score, talking about how memories live on in our bodies. Because even when our mind wants a connection, we can know that our mind craves a connection, but our bodies are storing something from earlier on, and that stress can be stored in the nervous system and play out in our physical selves in moments of intimacy for a lot of people. And so trust can feel like a constant negotiation. If our first relationship didn't feel secure or lasting, trusting that the current one will endure can feel like a leap. Also, many of us worry about being fully seen, our struggles, our needs, our history. We can kind of go between feeling very, very needy, and that can be very overwhelming for the person that we're trying to have a relationship with. And then out of the blue, we can become very withdrawn and distant, equally overwhelming and confusing. And so these patterns are not just frustrating for ourselves, they can wreak havoc in our personal lives and affect many, many people. Often we fear being viewed as too much, and this can lead to us kind of showing up as an inauthentic, almost polished version of ourselves instead of the one that feels genuine. And this is something that we as adopted people have been doing really since the beginning, that sense of trying to fit in. Research on attachment shows that early disruptions influence how we connect to others later. So, as I mentioned, this can show up as pushing people away, holding on too tightly, or cycling between the two. Many of us work hard in relationships to kind of maintain a stability and try to earn that security, almost in the same way that we did with our parents or our adoptive family. Others will stay quiet to avoid conflict and leave before we can be left. And this is also something that compounds the confusion because we're so internalized, many of us, that all of our thoughts and fears, they play out in our own minds, and we don't know how to articulate them. We don't know how to verbalize them. And so we can leave people very confused and often unaware of what's actually going on at the core of ourselves in adult relationships. Others of us become skilled observers. We adjust ourselves to the emotional atmosphere around us. As I've mentioned before, we do this as children, but we also do this as adults in relationship. Whereas others will just keep distance altogether to avoid disappointment. So yeah, the patterns can be very, very frustrating, hurtful to many parties, but they do make sense. They make complete sense given what we learned through experience about safety and connection early on. For adopted people, love and loss were paired from the start. And so this can create an unconscious fear of intimacy, not because we don't want closeness. In fact, we craved it. We've always craved it, but it can feel so risky. And as relationships deepen, old themes can surface in ways that are hard to name. We might test relationships, consciously or not, to see whether someone will stay, or we might hide grief around adoption, questions about identity, or our struggles with belonging, which is one of the biggest words in the vocabulary of an adopted person, this idea of belonging. Where do we truly belong? Some of us gravitate towards relationships that feel familiar, partners who are distant, emotionally unavailable, perhaps seeming very together, verging on sometimes the controlling, because that feels safe, because we feel so chaotic and so out of control. And then often we find ourselves in a relationship that doesn't feel right, doesn't feel balanced. And these dynamics echo the uncertainty that we once knew, and situations where affection just requires effort that we don't really understand. So when these patterns repeat, they can just feel like evidence that something is wrong with us, because these patterns repeating, and I've spoken to many adopted people, multiple failed relationships is something that is absolutely prevalent in the adopted community. And they're so misunderstood because the people that become hurt become very often angry, and then society can look at what's happening here, and you can get branded as somebody, negative, or it's kind of like the same thing as when you were an externalizer, let's say, or a difficult teenager. These patterns follow right into adult emotional relationships, and so there's a sense often of judgment, and all of this can just result in us feeling even more flawed than we have before. And this is why this is such an important topic for people to understand, why we create these patterns and where that is coming from. Because we can interpret that as evidence that something is wrong with us, but in reality, it's just a reflection in real life of how we learned to protect ourselves. As a knock-on effect from that, parenthood can trigger all sorts of emotional reactions in people, and this definitely can vary. Parenthood stirs layers of meaning for adopted people that aren't always visible to others. In fact, most times they're not visible to others. And once again, there's this sort of narrative that can play out in the wider community or in the wider family about what that means in their vocabulary. But for an adopted person, it's so layered. For some, parenthood brings a powerful sense of recognition, seeing ourselves reflected in our child for the first time after a lifetime of not matching those around us can be really, really important moment. And we can feel that viscerally because it's the first time that we have that genetic mirror. But even these positive feelings can be really complex. Parenting while carrying old wounds can feel very lonely, and we might find ourselves tending to both our child and to the younger parts of ourselves that didn't get what they needed early on. Early separation can resurface. Holding a newborn can raise questions about our own first moments, whether our biological mother held us, what she felt, and how that separation unfolded. Others become highly attuned parents, constantly checking in with the child's well-being because we remember what it felt like when our own needs weren't fully recognised. And I'd just like to add at this point, for those adopted people who were brought up in a very loving, caring family, those needs still weren't fully recognised because the trauma, the separation, and how we adapted to that. We did that on our own because certainly for many of us at the time that we were adopted, nobody was talking about what that truly meant. So our own needs weren't fully recognised, even in a loving, caring family. So other adopted people can feel overwhelmed by a child's dependence, and that can stir memories of early vulnerability. Loving our child can also deepen the ache around our own relinquishment because it can make past decisions around our adoption feel even harder to understand. So, really, it's very, very layered and complicated. And for some, the idea of parenting just feels too triggering or uncertain. So, they decide not to pursue it. And this is a very thoughtful, conscious, and valid decision, because concerns around repeating patterns or not being able to meet a child's need are very real and very frightening for a lot of people. Other knock-on effects and emotional reactions that we experience as adults, things like what I call calendar pain, significant dates. Some dates hit differently for adopted people. Examples would be birthdays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, adoption anniversaries. All of these can carry such an emotional weight that others very often don't see. Birthdays can be really layered. What's a celebration for many can also mark the day of our separation from our first mother, or the beginning of that journey of separation. And even in loving families, that dual meaning can just sort of sit there in the background, because we know that our bodies can't articulate what we remember within our nervous systems, but we can find ourselves feeling unsettled at certain times of year without necessarily immediately knowing why. But very often we sort of realize when we start to look into these things, these dates will align with moments, really significant moments in our early history. Mother's Day and Father's Day can bring really mixed emotions because they honor relationships that can feel often very complicated. And we might be grieving one parent while fully trying to celebrate another. There are also dates that matter really deeply, but that aren't acknowledged. The day we were placed, the day we left the hospital, all of these unmarked anniversaries still live within us. And the lack of public understanding around these dates make it really hard and very lonely. Because if sharing our mixed feelings risks being misunderstood or ungrateful, we can stay silent, adding yet another layer to an already set of complex emotions. And this is why it's so many people report the fact of being adopted as so isolated almost and lonely, is because we most times don't have anyone that we can talk about any of this with. But understanding these patterns does help us to recognize that our responses do make sense. They were intuitive reactions given the early experiences. And so, if we can open our minds with curiosity and ultimately compassion towards ourselves, change does become possible, because we can learn to distinguish old fears from current realities. And then when it comes to relationships, we can set boundaries that feel healthier. We can begin to rebuild trust in ourselves and in others, and maybe try and move towards connection that doesn't rely on hypervigilance or people pleasing. Because the patterns that once helped us cope don't have to define our future relationships. This awareness creates room for different choices. As I always say, our responses were intelligent reactions to what we endured and experienced and ultimately survived. And with greater understanding, it can become easier to build relationships that support who we are now, not just who we had to be. As always, thank you for watching. If this resonated, feel free to share it and leave a comment. It's amazing to have a community of people who have experienced very, very similar things and difficulties throughout their lives. And we're here to validate and to support each other. And I have put the link in the description box below of my book, Adopted and Seen, which is some of this content is drawn from that because these are the themes that we all experience. But I've talked about that enough on previous videos. But if you'd like to check it out and have a look, you'll find the link in the description below. Thank you very much, and I'll be back again soon.